So why did the economic and military giant, the United States, lose the Vietnam War? We'll look at the Nixon years leading up to Vietnamization and the policy of détente. So a number of reasons. We looked at one last lesson regarding American military tactics, search and destroy, the kill ratio, the attempt to meet the Viet Cong on the open field and defeat them. Basically didn't work, as the Viet Cong didn't play the rules of the game. They used guerrilla tactics, hit and run ambush, and won the hearts and minds of the people of South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive we saw was a huge turning point, although a military failure in many ways for the North Vietnamese forces and the Viet Cong supporting them in the south. It was a propaganda success in terms of it appearing that the American military strategy after 3 years was not working. The Viet Cong was still able to mount a large offensive, and it led to a change in political leadership and ultimately to American withdrawal. Also, of course, highlighted the huge costs of the war. We'll look today at some atrocities which also impact on American support, such as the My Lai Massacre, and finally how all of these factors, I guess, lead to opposition in the USA. At the top, there's a lack of political will, and there's growing opposition amongst many segments of American society. So Nixon won the election in November '68. He'd become president in '69, and as we looked at last time, he's determined to end American involvement in Vietnam. How is he going to do that? Well, in 1969, Kissinger and Nixon announced a reduction in troop numbers. This was a policy of Vietnamization. In other words, to train South Vietnamese troops to take over the main fighting role from the Americans. Something which, and again, the US tried to do very recently in Iraq with not much success. From 1968 then to 1973, this shift, this Vietnamization took place from the US to the South Vietnamese troops. Ultimately, what Nixon didn't want is the word defeat associated with his name, so he called it peace with honor. Well, was it successful? They tried, alongside this strategy of Vietnamization, they tried negotiation as well. And at the Paris peace talks, they tried to persuade North Vietnam to withdraw from the south at the same time as US troops withdrew from the north. And they threatened a massive air attack. Well, there wasn't much will to do that. It was a bluff, essentially, and the North also refused. They also tried to persuade the USSR and China to influence the North. Although, ideologically, the USSR and China, why are they going to help the USA fight against a communist nationalist force in Vietnam? Certainly there isn't any motivation to do so. Let's have a look now at the tragic events in My Lai, a massacre. This happened earlier on in the war, but in 1969 the US public found out about it. Essentially, a search and destroy mission had gone horrifically, tragically. Well, it's hard. Did it go wrong? I mean, there was murder. Yeah, there's no other word for it. US soldiers had been told that Viet Cong were in a village, got to the village and basically murdered men, women and children, civilians at My Lai. Some claimed that they were Viet Cong, but it's hard to reconcile that with images of grandmothers and terrified children being shot. It's very moving, disturbing stuff. Yeah, Lieutenant William Calley, who led one of the waves into My Lai, was court-martialed but received no jail time, and it really horrified the US public. How can the US Army be the heroes when they're butchering innocent civilians? So My Lai also impacted on American support for the war. Again, you can see here, this is an American newspaper, front page news, and you can see that it's awful pictures of children and women slain by GIs. This, of course, then contributed to, as I've already said, the lack of public support for the war amongst many segments of American society. Conservative American opinion actually continued in its support, but there was growing opposition, especially amongst students on university campuses. So certainly faltering support in the United States. Well, did the policy of Vietnamization actually work? In a short answer, no. But why? Well, the South Vietnamese simply were not strong enough to defeat the communists. General Thieu, who was in charge at the time, similar to Ngo Dinh Diem earlier on, lacked the support and loyalty of the majority of Vietnamese people who were mostly peasants. You had the support of richer landlords and the Catholic Church, but not the great mass of South Vietnamese peasants. And you'd need that in order for your regime to survive. Let's have a look at some examples of how, if we're looking overall at the US policy of containment, of stopping the spread of communism, then Vietnam is a spectacular failure, as in many ways it contributes to what America feared. It's something of a domino effect, certainly in the limited local regions. So the US stepped up bombing. They were withdrawing their troops, but they stepped up bombing, especially in Laos and Cambodia. A horrifying amount of bombs were dropped, including cluster bombs, which still kill innocent civilians and children today, as a lot of unexploded ordnance in Cambodia and in Laos. Indirectly then, this actually increased support for the Khmer Rouge, a horrific, radical agrarian communist. They took power in Cambodia in 1975 in a genocidal attempt to return to some pre-industrial past. Ironically and strangely, the Americans actually supported this murderous regime because they actually were involved in a war with America's main enemy at the time, Vietnam. So example there of a rather amoral foreign policy. The Pathet Lao took control in Laos in 1975, and again, undoubtedly, the fact that American bombing, it probably contributed to the takeover of these communist regimes. So really, the worst of all possible worlds, quite possibly, for America and containment in terms of trying to contain communism. In 1973, a ceasefire was eventually agreed. Sorry, I lost my place a bit here. The 1972 Communist Offensive, let me get my place. Okay, so in January 73, sorry about that, a ceasefire was finally agreed and US troops withdrew. And crucially for the North, America had promised basically to stop bombing in return for this ceasefire. Well, as soon as America withdrew all of its troops, it meant that the South simply could not continue, especially without American air support. And in 1975, the South finally fell. So 73, the last American troops are out, and 75, the regime falls. America's now stopped bombing support as well. So fighting resumed, as I said. Sorry, it's a very messy lesson today. Fighting resumed as soon as US forces pulled out. In 75, there is this major offensive by the North. And as I already said, without US air support, the South simply could not resist. And finally, in April 1975, the final capture of Saigon, or as it's called now, Ho Chi Minh City. A rather famous image here of a North Vietnamese tank. I'm not sure whether it's Russian or Chinese. I think it's a Russian tank, crashing through the gates of the palace, which is now called the Reunification Palace. So I hope you made notes on these things. You know, just the last few images sort of cementing the humiliation of the American withdrawal, people fighting to get on those last helicopters leaving from the American embassy. So, cost of war, 55,000 American soldiers killed. It's estimates up to 2 million Vietnamese. I mean, war is a tragedy, and these statistics just reinforce that. Costs, financial costs, as well as the deaths. The peak of spending in 68, $1 billion a day, 88 billion in total in 1968. And compare that, it's basically almost 4 times what was able to be spent on education, health and housing. Remember, that contributed to Johnson resigning, but failing to contest a second term. As I've already said, it failed to contain communism. Vietnam became communist under Ho Chi Minh, and also Cambodia and Laos. There was a decline in confidence and trust in the American government within America as well. And Nixon and Kissinger embarked on a new policy towards communism and what they perceived as the centre of communism, the USSR, and also China as well, another major communist power. And that was an attempt to avoid conflict, maintain a separate system, but deal and negotiate with the USSR, and especially with China. This is the policy of détente. Okay, lesson over.